the postcard, and the widow. It arrived in silence, slipped between a stack of unpaid invoices and the creased corner of an old case file. The postcard bore no name, no return address, only a single phrase scrawled in faded ink. Nolly me tan hair. Do not touch me. Francesco Mori turned it over in his hand. The image on the front was sun-bleached, a coastal view, the hills of Cagliari stretching beneath a lavender sky. Sardinia. The stamp was local, postmarked from a village just north of the capital. There were no fingerprints, no smudges. It had been handled carefully, too carefully. He didn't know why it unsettled him at first. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the Latin, a phrase pulled from an older world, the kind spoken in hushed tones across stone altars and blood-slicked fields. Or perhaps it was something else, a gut-born whisper that this message was not meant for any man still living, but rather someone long buried. Days passed before the next sign came. A woman arrived at his office in Palermo, dressed in black, her eyes rimmed with sorrow that seemed deeper than mourning. She introduced herself only as the widow of Professor Matteo LaRusso, a Cagliari historian whose name Mori recognized from obscure citations, articles on post-war disappearances, footnotes on fascist-endorsed smuggling, and the long silence that had swallowed Sardinia's darkest years. LaRusso had been found dead in his villa overlooking the sea, a pistol in his hand. A locked room. The case had been closed as suicide. But his widow insisted otherwise. He had been afraid in the weeks before his death, paranoid, withdrawn. And more than that, he had told her he was on the edge of something terrible. Something that had been buried with war crimes. Mori agreed to investigate, though he didn't yet know why. Perhaps it was the widow's voice, or the timing of the postcard, or the way history itself seemed to have leaned just a little closer. He arrived in Cagliari under a gray sky, the sea sullen and metallic. The villa stood alone on a cliff's edge, shutters drawn tight, a place once filled with books and sun now emptied of everything but silence. The police had sealed nothing. There had been no signs of struggle, no reason to suspect foul play, but Mori knew how quickly truth could be buried beneath the word routine. Inside, time had not yet reclaimed the rooms. Notes still clung to corkboards. Tea stains ghosted across maps. The air held the faint scent of ink and salt. It was in the study, dim, untouched, its windows crusted with salt spray, that he found the first real clue. A copy of Tacitus, hollowed at the center, tucked inside, folded with delicate precision, was a torn map fragment. No labels, no landmarks, just a triangle of coastline marked with a red X. Along its edge, 3 words in LaRusso's hurried script. Via della Croce. The second discovery was more damning. Beneath a loose floorboard, Mori found a torn page from what must have been LaRusso's journal. Most of the text had been scribbled out or water damaged beyond recognition. But one line had survived, underlined twice. The archivist who never left. He stood for a long time in that study, the sound of the waves crashing just below the cliff echoing through the empty walls. The message was clear. LaRusso had found something. Something meant to stay hidden. Something tied to bloodlines, to betrayal, and to the ghosts of war who still wandered Sardinia's silent hills. And now, whatever it was Mori's. The Archivist's trail. The fragment of map whispered louder than any spoken warning. Mori had studied its edges with the patience of a man who knew history, rarely spoke directly. The coastline marked in red bore no tourist trail, no military base. Just scrubland and thistle, inland from the crumbling estates of Sardinia's forgotten nobility. But the words Via della Croce had anchored it in something concrete, a real road, a real place. And so he followed it. The trail led him beyond the postcard vistas of colliery, into the hills where silence reigned and the sun baked the roads in a glare that forced the world into stillness. There, hidden among overgrown olive trees and the brittle bones of the land, stood the ruins of a once grand estate. The manor had been surrendered to time decades ago, its windows gaping like wounds, its iron gates rusted shut and leaning forward as though in a final bow. This had been home of Count Roberto Salvi, a name Mori had encountered in the footnotes of post-war smuggling investigations, a patron of the arts, a philanthropist, and, if the buried files could be trusted, an alleged facilitator of secret Nazi escapes in 1946, just months before the Vatican ratlins were dismantled. No charges had ever stuck. No trial had followed. Count Salvi had simply faded from the record. Too rich to be punished, too powerful to be remembered. Inside, the manor was a carcass. Dust choked the staircases. Birds acclaimed the drawing rooms, and the scent of old mold clung to the walls like a second skin. But in the library, behind what had once been a velvet curtain, Mori found the first thread worth pulling. A photo album, its pages stiff with age, its leather cover cracked. Each photo was a portrait, men in suits, women in veils, faces captured in sepia, smiling, formal, untouched by consequence. But behind those faces lay something else. One man, in particular, stood out, not for his expression, but for the insignia barely visible at the corner of his lapel. It was the same sigil Mori had seen etched into a vault door deep beneath Palermo months earlier. A cross-torch and quill, the mark of a secret order that had shaped more than Sicily's fate. Tucked behind the album, he found another folder, unmarked, untouched. Inside were uncatalogued documents, typed lists, signatures, foreign bank slips, receipts bearing Nazi military seals, each one a small fire waiting to be lit. And yet, amid the hush of the estate, Mori felt a new tension. He was no longer alone. Somewhere beyond the sagging hallway, he sensed it, not the crash of footsteps, not the rustle of movement, but the absence of sound where there should have been stillness, the kind of silence only a predator knows how to keep. He moved through the manor carefully, tracing the scent of tobacco until he found it. A porcelain teacup resting beside the hidden cellar door, the liquid inside still warm, a single cigarette burning in its lip, unsmoked. A message, a warning, written in the dust beside it, with a finger. This history is not yours to claim. Mori stared at the words, the silence around him deepening. Whoever had written it had come and gone without fear, without haste. Someone with access, someone with knowledge. The cellar door remained shut, but he would not open it. Not yet. Not without knowing what waited beneath. Instead, he stepped back into the light, his coat marked with dust, his thoughts sharper now. The widow had been right. Lorusso had been close. Too close. And someone had made sure he didn't live to tell what he found. But Mori wasn't chasing a single historian's truth anymore. He was following the trail of the archivist who never left. And if the ghosts of war still haunted Sardinia's hills, it was because they had never been buried, only hidden. The forgotten tunnel. The days in Sardinia grew hotter, but Mori's path only led him deeper into the cold marrow of its buried history. The warning left at the manor haunted him, not just for its message, but for its precision. Whoever had followed him hadn't just been watching. They had known exactly what he would find, and exactly where he would go. It wasn't fear that tightened in Mori's chest now. It was a certainty that he was being drawn into something deliberately. Someone wanted him close, but not too close. He left the manor and the waiting cellar door behind. For now, the photo album and uncatalogued papers were safely tucked away, but it was a phrase still etched into the dust that lingered. This history is not yours to claim. Back in Colliery, the city was a maze of sunlit ruins and bureaucratic silence. But a new name emerged from the notes left by the historian LaRusso, Dr. Eliana Fenu, a cultural historian once affiliated with the Colliery Historical Institute. She had vanished from the academic scene 2 years prior, under what the papers called administrative reassignment. Mori called it something else. Silencing. She met him in a quiet courtyard near the university district, her hair tied in a loose knot, her eyes sharp behind round glasses. She didn't ask how he'd found her. She simply said she had been expecting him. Fenna hadn't just known LaRusso, she'd worked with him. Not publicly, and not under the Institute's banner. Their research had veered too close to the kind of history Italy didn't want told. The black market smuggling of war criminals, the fascist families who survived the fall by laundering their legacies through museums, charities, and, most damning of all, false records. LaRusso had believed that beneath the modern gloss of Colliery lay something older, something designed to disappear. He called it the Ghost Archive. According to Eliana, the story had begun with whispers from fishermen and former smugglers. During the final years of the war, Castello di San Michele, an ancient hilltop fortress that once guarded the city, had been used as a trading post. Beneath it, hidden in natural caves and medieval tunnels, sat a chamber where documents were exchanged for gold, names for new identities. The war had ended, but the chamber had never been sealed. It had simply been forgotten. Or so they thought. The descent. Eliana guided Mori to the edge of the city, where the fortress rose above the trees like a skeletal crown. Tourists wandered its perimeter, snapping photos and marveling at the views, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. The noble conspiracy. It took them the better part of 2 claustrophobic hours to find a way out. The tunnel behind them had collapsed with surgical precision, enough stone and earth to block retreat, but not enough to bury them. Whoever had done it hadn't wanted them dead. Not yet. They'd wanted them shaken, and they had succeeded. Mori and Eliana emerged through a maintenance shaft built into the northern side of the fortress, brushing away decades of dust and debris. When they surfaced, it was nearly dawn. The sky over Colliery was pale and indifferent, the city beginning to stir unaware of what had been unearthed beneath it. The ledger now hidden inside Mori's coat was more than a relic. It was a ticking device. The names it carried, etched in faded type and ink-smudged signatures, could bring down dynasties, if they lived long enough to show it. But there was one name that had been circled, not in ink, but pressed into the paper with a heavy, deliberate hand. Armandi, a name that carried weight even in Palermo. A thread through nobility. Baron Federico Armandi was not a man of the past. He was very much alive, very much visible, and, in Mori's experience, very protected. A Sardinian by blood, but a figure whose name appeared in the upper registers of Sicilian philanthropy, art restoration, and historical preservation circles. The kind of man who donated to cathedrals, curated exhibitions about fascism's downfall, and posed for magazines beside smiling diplomats. A facade, a very polished one. Eliana had heard whispers during her time at the Historical Institute. Rumors that certain noble houses in Sardinia had preserved not only their wealth, but the infrastructure of secrecy built during the war. They had done so by disguising stolen assets as charitable endowments, by laundering documents and identities through archives they themselves controlled. LaRusso had been close to naming them. That much was now clear, and the Armandi family had likely been among the most threatened by what he found. But this wasn't just about wealth. It was about the order, the same one Mori had encountered in Sicily, beneath the ruins of a forgotten vault. That symbol, the cross, torch, and quill, had appeared again in the ledger, beside multiple signatures tied to the Armandi name. This was no coincidence. The vow, as it turned out, had not died in the ashes of Palermo. It had simply expanded. The gala at Villa Armandi. 2 nights later, Mori stood before the wrought iron gates of Villa Armandi, dressed in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. The gala was being held under the pretense of celebrating Sardinian heritage, a curated event for aristocrats, museum directors, and politicians. The guest list was curated, the conversations rehearsed, the wine imported and decanted. Mori had acquired his invitation through Vittorio Leone's network, though the Sicilian power broker had not responded to Mori's latest messages. A bad sign. Mori assumed he was watching, waiting. Vittorio never entered a fight unless the outcome was already tipping in his favor. Inside the villa, beneath arched ceilings and oil paintings of imagined ancestors, Mori became another elegant stranger. He moved through the crowd, brushing shoulders with heirs to forgotten fortunes, catching glimpses of names he'd seen typed in the ghost archive. They were all here, laughing, toasting, whispering. It was not guilt that held them together. It was certainty, the certainty that their secrets were old enough to be untouchable. And at the center of it all, standing beneath a massive chandelier of Murano glass, was Baron Federico Armandi. He was tall, composed, with an air of calculated benevolence. His smile was constant but never warm, the smile of a man who'd spent decades deceiving everyone in the room, including himself. Mori approached carefully, introducing himself as a minor cultural advisor from Palermo, studying noble archives for an upcoming exhibit. The Baron didn't flinch at the name. If he recognized Mori, he gave no sign, but his eyes watched closely, measuring every word, every gesture. Their conversation was veiled, courteous, dangerous. Armandi asked about Sicily, about the state of historical memory. He commented on the need for a responsible curation of wartime narratives. He offered hollow condolences on the loss of Professor LaRusso. Mori responded with the same precision, mentioning an interest in wartime estate transfers and how certain noble holdings had survived Allied occupation with suspicious ease. At the mention of smuggled documents, the Baron's glass paused just short his lips. A flicker, not fear, but awareness. He knew. He didn't deny anything. He simply smiled and said that the past, in his experience, only remained buried when those who unearthed it understood the cost of exposure. The implication was not subtle. The library within. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A curator from Florence, flush with wine, led a wandering group into the Baron's private library. Armandi allowed it, but Mori noticed a brief exchange between him and a security advisor, an unspoken warning. Mori slipped away from the group, navigating between towering bookshelves and glass cabinets filled with medieval charters and rare folios. At the back of the room, he found a locked display case. The symbol was etched faintly in gold at the base, torch and quill. Inside were sealed envelopes, official government markings, war-era stamps, and beneath them, something unmistakable. A page torn from the same ledger Mori had recovered beneath Castello di San Michele. This was proof, not just of preservation, but of intentional curation. The Baron hadn't buried history. He had been collecting it, preserving it as leverage, holding on to secrets that could destroy rivals, rewrite narratives, or keep generations of bloodlines immune to consequence. Mori took what he could, a photograph, quickly snapped with a hidden lens. It wouldn't be enough to bring down a man like Armandi on its own, but it would open the first crack. He returned to Gala, blending once again into the music, the laughter, the toast to a brighter European heritage. But something had changed. The vow had not been a relic. It had always been international. And now Mori understood Sicily had only been the prologue. The real conspiracy stretched across borders, through noble houses, down into the archives of the dead. The silent court. The storm broke just before dawn. Winds rolled in from the Tyrrhenian Sea, tearing through Colliery's crumbling facades and salt-stained alleys, as if the island itself was beginning to waken. Beneath the clash of thunder and the rattling of shutters, Francesco Mori stood by the window of a dim hotel room, the photograph of Baron Armandi's private archive clenched in his hand, a part of the ledger, the same parchment he'd unearthed beneath the fortress, kept not as memory but as currency. There was no longer any doubt. Armandi and his bloodline had preserved not just fascist wealth, but its narrative, the documents, names, and truths needed to reshape history, if ever challenged. With one version of history, they ruled quietly. With another, they could burn their enemies from behind velvet curtains. And now, they were fighting to maintain control of that power. He didn't have long to dwell. A soft knock broke the silence. 3 times, quick and precise, the signal only Isabella would use. She stepped into the room, rain glistening on her shoulders, eyes tight with urgency. She had just arrived from Palermo, and she had come with news. Back at Mori's own archive, a place few ever visited, where his private records were kept under false floorboards and surveillance, someone had broken in, or tried to. The locks had held, but just barely. The attempt had not been quiet. Someone had rifled through cabinets, forced drawers, left the lights burning as a message. They were searching for everything, not just documents. The full ledger, the ghost archive, the page Mori had salvaged from the dead historian's villa. And more chilling still, Isabella had received a letter. No signature, just a line typed in courier font. The court waits in silence. You will answer. It took them less than a day to find the place. Not on any map, not in any legal register. But the name, the silent court, had appeared in LaRusso's fragmented notes, half erased and smudged with ink. Courtroom, no longer in use. Judge's chamber locked. The last testimony sealed in the walls. The Court of Shadows. The old building was a relic of Mussolini's regime, abandoned since the 1950s, hidden behind state land disputes and fencing that had long since rusted away. No signage marked it, only a faded plaque, its lettering flaked and barely legible, whispered its old purpose. Tribunal Militare Regionale, Sezione Straordinaria. Mori knew the kind. These courts had existed across the country during the war's final years. Special sections created to judge dissenters, process deserters, and erase witnesses. The rot had seeped into the walls. Cracked linoleum and dust-covered verdict ledgers. Chairs overturned. Scales of justice stained with mildew. But the back chamber, once the judge's private office, had remained sealed. It took Isabella nearly 20 minutes with her tools to force the rusted lock. Inside, time had been frozen, the desk untouched, a coat still hanging, and beneath the floorboards, a sealed compartment, almost too careful to be coincidence. Inside, a bundle of age papers, each stamped with the crest of Armandi's estate and the mark Mori now knew too well, the cross torch and quill. This was it, the evidence the historian LaRusso had died for, not theories, not whispers, but records. A falsified military tribunal ruling authorizing the execution of partisan agitators. Names redacted, but LaRusso had restored some from elsewhere. Transfer orders linking Armandi's father, Vittorio Armandi, directly to a regional massacre during the German retreat. And worse, a document authorizing the collection and assimilation of property, document, and heirs of dissident families, reclassified as foreign collaborators in a scheme to erase them. Legalized theft, institutionalized execution, all tied directly to the Armandi name. and it had been hidden here, in a chamber built for silence. The offer, but as they turned to leave, they found themselves cornered. Two figures blocked the exit, dressed in civilian clothing, but with the unmistakable poise of men trained to clean up messes quietly. No weapons drawn, just the chilling stillness of those who had done this many times before. One of them spoke, not in threat, but in warning. They told Mori the evidence he carried was not meant to survive, and that its survival could end far more than reputations. But then came the real blow. They held out a folder, pristine and sealed. On its front, Francesco Mori's name, typed on official Palermo Homicide Division letterhead. Inside, according to the man, were documents linking Mori directly to the death of Professor Matteo LaRusso, doctored statements, false witness accounts, and fabricated forensic reports. Enough to bury Mori for the murder. Enough to turn every ally into an enemy. The terms were simple. Hand over documents. Walk away. Let history rest, or be swallowed by it. No surrender. For a long moment, Mori said nothing. Isabella's gaze met his. There was fear in her eyes, but not for herself. And then Mori made his choice. He turned, handing Isabella a hidden drive from his coat, a duplicate of the files they just found, encoded and ready. He told her to leave. Immediately, then without a word, he reached for his phone and tapped the pre-scheduled transmission, a live feed, set to begin in 60 seconds, patched into the inbox of a trusted Sardinian journalist LaRusso had once worked with. When the men lunged forward, it was already too late. The documents, the photographs, the sealed orders, they were already in cloud, dispersing through encrypted feeds, each file tagged with the same title. The vow never died. The men didn't fight. There was no struggle, only silence and a slow retreat. The kind that came not from defeat, but from recognition. They had lost a moment, and that was all Mori had needed. The truth they tried to burn. The streets of Cagliari cracked open beneath the weight of revelation. It began with a headline in an independent Sardinian paper. Ghost Archives Unearthed, the Armandi Legacy and Fascist Cover-Ups. Within hours, it was no longer confined to the island. By nightfall, the story had spread to Palermo, Rome, then London and Berlin. The leak was everywhere. Photographs of the ledgers, images of tribunal orders stamped with fascist seals, names, numbers, receipts, testimonies. No longer secrets. Now evidence. Francesco Mori watched the fire ignite from a high cliff road outside the city, a cigarette untouched in his fingers, the coastal wind catching the sound of distant sirens. The building they'd found, the silent court, had been sealed again, this time under the order of the Sardinian Ministry of Culture, claiming public safety concerns. But the damage had already been done. The past was no longer buried. It had been exhumed. Fire and silence. It came swiftly. Across the city, as institutions scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, a second campaign began. Fires. First, an old university archive. Then, a private estate belonging to the Armandi family in Nuoro. Hours later, a sealed museum depot went up in flames. Places known only to a handful of people. Yet all targeted with surgical precision. The order, or what remained of it, had not vanished. It had simply changed tactics. If the truth couldn't be controlled anymore, it would be erased. Mori and Isabella moved fast, reaching out to journalists, historians, even archivists who had once shunned them. Some responded with cautious curiosity. Others refused. A few simply disappeared. But one clue remained. A thread left hanging from LaRusso's original journal. A passage that referenced a chapel tucked into the cliffs along Sardinia's southern coast. No name, no location, just this line. Where the archivist's blood was first spilled, the last truth remains. It was not a metaphor. It was a map, the coastal chapel. They found it after 2 days of searching, tucked into a wind-swept gorge where no paved road reached. The structure was modest, white stone, roof half collapsed, a rustic cross leaning toward the sea, long forgotten, long hidden. Inside, nature had begun its quiet reclamation. Ivy curled through broken windows. Seabirds nested where worshippers once knelt. But beneath the altar, sealed behind a wall of scorched limestone, was a cavity marked with the Archivist sigil. Inside, a sealed metal box, and within it, the final cache. This was no ledger. It was something more dangerous. A black book of correspondences between known fascist officials and post-war nobility, letters written in careful cursive, boasting of rerouted wealth, false deaths, and international escape routes. It named intermediaries in Switzerland, bribes in the Vatican, even a diplomat in Palermo who had rewritten entire death records. But most damning of all, a statement signed by Baron Vittorio Armandi, the father of the current Baron, a cold, unrepentant admission of the massacre at Campo Mertu, an incident long blamed on partisan crossfire, now revealed to be an orchestrated extermination of resistance sympathizers. And it had been done under the protection of a symbol, the cross-torching quill, the same vow, the same order, not only Sicilian, not only Sardinian, European, systemic, alive. Mori stood with the final page in hand, the ink faded but legible, Isabella beside him, her expression unreadable, torn between vindication and grief. This was what LaRusso had died for, what the Archivist had hidden, what the Order had tried to burn. Ashes and waves. They didn't speak as they left the chapel, sealing it behind them as the sun began to dip into the horizon. The light fractured over the water, casting golden lines across the cliffs, and in that moment, the island felt older than time itself. Mori stood at the cliff's edge, holding the final page. He read it once more slowly, then slid it into protective folio beneath his coat. He would not let it burn, not this one. The truth had been bloodied, fragmented, nearly erased, but it had survived. The vow had not, but the truth had, and that at last was enough.